Imagine a massive empire across the entire Middle East. Persians built the first true superpower of antiquity. They held perfect roads and endless wealth, and an elite army called the Immortals. From his golden throne, the king ruled arrogantly. Nothing seemed to threaten their absolute power, but a challenge came from a small fortress. Young Alexander the Great emerged seeking glory. He led a highly disciplined Macedonian army. Their long spears crushed Persian wooden shields. Persia's fatal flaw was its slow, confused generals and the utter panic of King Darius III. In terror, he drove his royal chariot away, abandoning his family to the advancing enemy. The empire's grand pillars began to collapse. Palaces turned to ruins beneath desert sand. This fall proved one crucial historical rule. Size means absolutely nothing with a weak leader, especially against a true unmatched military genius. The mighty Persian Empire simply faded into ashes. If you lived in Rome during its glorious, golden age, you would sincerely believe it was the absolute center of the whole universe. Romans successfully conquered half the known world. They built massive aqueducts, the Grand Colosseum, and perfectly paved roads still used today. But how can such an invincible empire ever fall? Very simply, it slowly begins to rot from within. The state was consumed by total corruption and civil wars. Emperors changed constantly. Sometimes these rulers were violently killed by their own bodyguards just short months after coronation. Rome became entirely too large to manage. Divided into two weakened parts, the Western Empire became easy prey. Germanic tribes, arrogantly called barbarians, simply walked across borders that no one was left to defend. In 476, the last emperor fell, and antiquity's great civilization plunged forever into the gloomy shadows of the cold, unforgiving Dark Ages. Forget what you know about history's greatest conquests. Genghis Khan built a massive realm, the largest contiguous empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. They swept away absolutely everything in their path, moving like an unstoppable natural disaster, using unmatched speed and sheer terror. But what can destroy such an invincible force? That is right, the ambitious Mongols themselves. When a territory becomes unbelievably vast, managing it from one tent becomes impossible. After the death of the unifying Khans, descendants began dividing this limitless power. Brother turned against brother in bloody feuds. Destructive civil wars erupted across the steppes. The invincible empire split into 4 separate khanates. These divided realms slowly grew weaker and isolated. The conquerors eventually assimilated into local cultures. They conquered half of the known world, but could not conquer their own endless ambitions. The greatest nomadic empire simply faded into history. When Rome fell, the empire did not disappear. The East survived another 1,000 years. Constantinople became the wealthiest city on earth, guarded by the impenetrable Theodosian walls, but centuries of endless wars exhausted them. Their vast territory shrank decade after decade. Religious disputes divided the once united population. Trade routes shifted, leaving the treasury empty. Allies from the West tragically abandoned them. By 1453, the empire was one isolated city. A sultan arrived with a massive Ottoman army. Byzantines faced a terrifying new technological weapon. Giant cannons bombarded the legendary ancient walls. Citizens prayed desperately inside the Hagia Sophia. Despite heroic resistance, numbers were completely unequal. The broken walls collapsed under heavy fire. Attackers poured into the streets like a flood. The last emperor died fighting in the chaos. 1,000 years of history ended overnight. The great capital transformed into a new world. Even the longest empires eventually meet their end. Across the ocean, a different world thrived. Aztecs built a massive empire in central Mexico. The capital was a beautiful island city. Markets traded exotic feathers and pure gold. They engineered floating gardens and grand pyramids, but their supreme power had a high price. The empire heavily taxed the surrounding tribes, making bitter enemies of their own neighbors. Then, strange ships appeared on the eastern coast. Spanish explorers arrived seeking gold and land, but the newcomers were a tiny, isolated group. How did few strangers destroy an empire? Oppressed tribes eagerly joined the foreign invaders, creating a massive, unstoppable indigenous rebel army. Yet the deadliest weapon remained completely invisible. Strangers unknowingly brought a devastating biological plague. Disease swept rapidly through the dense city. The locals had absolutely no natural immunity. The bustling capital went completely, terrifyingly silent. In 1521, the grand Aztec civilization collapsed, leaving majestic stone pyramids swallowed by jungle. After conquering the Americas, Spain became a massive and truly global European superpower. Giant treasure fleets brought back endless riches. Mountains of silver flooded the royal courts. But unimaginable wealth brought a hidden curse. Too much silver destroyed the currency's value. Ordinary citizens could not afford basic bread. The economy suffered massive and crushing inflation. Kings spent everything on endless foreign conflicts, completely ignoring their own farms and industries. The royal crown declared bankruptcy several times, while corrupt nobles lived in extreme luxury. Overextended borders became completely impossible to defend. Rival nations began stealing their overseas shipments. The invincible naval armada was tragically destroyed. Spain's golden century slowly turned into dust. Overseas colonies eventually fought for their independence, stripping the weakened empire of its territories. The sun finally set on Spanish dominance, leaving behind empty palaces and massive debts, proving that infinite gold cannot buy survival. The Holy Roman Empire dominated Central Europe. For 1,000 years it claimed authority, but it was a complete political illusion. Famously described as neither holy nor Roman, and certainly not a real unified empire. It was a chaotic and messy patchwork. Hundreds of tiny independent German states coexisted. Local princes aggressively protected their own power. The elected emperor held almost no authority. Constant religious conflicts deeply divided the citizens. Neighbors fought bitterly over opposing Christian beliefs. The imperial parliament was slow and useless. Endless bureaucracy paralyzed every single government decision. Lawyers debated rules while the economy stagnated. Foreign powers easily manipulated the divided princes. The system became completely outdated and obsolete. Then, a French general named Napoleon arrived. His modern army crushed the outdated forces. The ancient institution crumbled without a fight. In 1806, the last emperor quietly resigned, a bureaucratic nightmare finally dissolving into history. The Ottoman Empire was a terrifying superpower. They famously conquered the legendary Byzantine capital. Their massive realm bridged Europe and Asia. Sultans ruled from magnificent, wealthy royal palaces, but even the greatest empires eventually stagnate. While Europe rapidly embraced the Industrial Revolution, Ottomans stubbornly rejected new technological advancements. They slowly became known as Europe's sick man. The mighty army lost its strict discipline. Elite royal guards repeatedly rebelled against sultans. Trade routes bypassed their heavily taxed territories. The imperial treasury suffered from massive debts. Diverse conquered nations began fighting for independence. Rebellions tore the weakened borders apart. Century after century, the vast territory shrank. Then the disaster of World War I arrived. The empire allied with the losing side. Foreign powers divided their few remaining lands. The once feared sultanate was officially abolished. A magnificent historical legacy faded into memory, leaving behind beautifully painted ceramic tiles. The Russian Empire was a massive frozen superpower, stretching endlessly from Europe to Asia. Tsars ruled with absolute unquestioned authority. They lived inside luxurious winter palaces, surrounded by beautiful golden Faber Hagues. But outside those walls, reality was brutal. Millions of peasants lived in freezing poverty, working on cold and unforgiving fields. The staggering wealth gap was catastrophic. Industrialization arrived late to the vast nation. Workers crowded into dark, dangerous city factories, demanding better lives. Citizens peacefully protested. Government forces responded with violent suppression. Then the disaster of World War I struck. The outdated army suffered massive military defeats. Food shortages caused desperate bread riots. The exhausted population simply refused to fight. In 1917, revolution swept the snowy streets. The last Tsar abdicated his throne. Centuries of imperial history vanished almost overnight, leaving a red flag flying over the snow. The British Empire was the largest ever, a global superpower where the sun never set. The mighty Royal Navy ruled the deep oceans, guarding highly profitable global trade routes. London became the center of the world, fueled by endless resources from overseas colonies. They built massive railways and grand factories. Managing a giant territory slowly became exhausting. Distant nations began demanding their own freedom. Peaceful protests challenged the strict colonial rule. Then the disaster of World War II suddenly arrived. Britain bravely fought to defend Europe. The terrible conflict deeply bankrupted the nation. The royal treasury was left completely empty. Ordinary citizens faced extremely strict food rationing. The completely exhausted country slowly lost its control. India peacefully claimed its own new independence. Other colonies followed this unstoppable wave. The mighty, overextended empire let go, transforming into a modern commonwealth of nations. The longest imperial reign ended with a sunset.